We're joined today by Salim Mansour of Western University. Hello, Salim.
Hello, Robert.
Salim, I think everybody knows of the events on Friday, September 22nd, in the Canadian Parliament, where they honored a 98-year-old Waffen-SS Galicia Division veteran, Yaroslav Hunka, for fighting against our Russian wartime allies. And this was done in the presence of Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who was attending Parliament.
We have here in the chamber today Ukrainian Canadian world veteran from the Second World War who fought the Ukrainian independence against the Russians and continues to support the troops today, even at his age of 98. His name is Yaroslav Hunka. He's a Ukrainian hero, a Canadian hero, and we thank him for all his service. Thank you.
The details behind how this man, Hunka, now possibly facing extradition to Poland, by the way, got to receive such a unanimous accolade from Parliament have been discussed at length since then, and we're not going to go into that nitty-gritty detail of who blames who, that kind of a thing, although we may touch on it. Suffice it to say that the Speaker of the House who introduced Hunka, that is Anthony Rota, has resigned his position. Every parliamentarian who rose to applaud Hunka has claimed ignorance, has given a half-hearted apology, and the Prime Minister has given the typical liberal apology type of thing, which is like, I'm sorry this offended you type, And he used the occasion to basically smear Russia as if it was Putin's fault. It's disgusting. Truly, we are living in a kakistocracy that is ruled by the most incompetent. In 1982, the book The Ominous Parallels, The End of Freedom in America, was published. The author, philosopher Leonard Peikoff, a Canadian, by the way, by birth, outlines how the culture of Weimar Republic Germany resembles the culture of America, predicting that America, if this continues, will go the way of a totalitarian state such as with the Nazis in Germany. Now, with the passing of every day, Dr. Peikoff's prediction is coming true. But not only for America, for Canada as well, where the pace of descent into tyranny is quickened with the election of Justin Trudeau, propped up by Jagmeet Singh, and an ineffectual opposition in the so-called Conservative Party. Now, I have a list of the ominous parallels drawn together. For now, let us get into the history of how we arrived at a disgraceful point in Canada's history where we would be honoring in Parliament unanimously a Nazi SS soldier who, by the way, has sworn allegiance to death to Hitler. As a matter of fact, I've got his oath right here. If he was part of the SS, I vow to you, Adolf Hitler, as Führer and Chancellor of the German Reich, loyalty and bravery, I vow to you and to the leaders that you set for me absolute allegiance until death. So help me God. So, Salim, how did we get here?
Robert, how did we get there is a long story.
We got time.
There on Friday, September 22nd, But this is what not only amuses me, strikes me, saddens me, but I think I'll offer this to start off, that there can be a silver lining, a positive in what is this story that you're talking about, we're talking about, a story, the standing ovation given to Volodymyr Zelenskyy, president of Ukraine, and the 98-year-old Yaroslav Hunka, former member of the Waffen-SS Galicia Division, in the visitors gallery. The loud clapping, cheering, standing ovation, and honor has echoed around the world. It is now the story right across the globe, and it is no more, a sort of a secret in our cupboard that we have hid for over 80 years, or at least 80 years. The story that Canada has been dabbling with Nazis, have had Nazis in this country, have protected Nazis in this country. That story is now out in the public. And like, if I use the metaphor, a scab, a wound that has dried up, and you don't play with it. But if you want to play with it, which is what our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been doing over the past 18 months of this war at Ukraine, and that's the story itself that we need to talk about, whether we do it today or some other time. If you pull on a scab, then all the pus, dried up or still fresh, is going to pour out of that wound. And that's what has happened. The scab has been pulled, and now it's coming all into the daylight. And the positive part of that is what I meant by in my opening, that there is a silver lining here, that we will have to deal with this story. We will have to deal with all of that pus that has gathered up. And this can be therapeutic. We'll have to come to terms with it, not only as Canadians, but as people, because Canada is a country of immigrants, particularly over the last half century, but going back to World War II, and even before that, we are a country of immigrants. And Canada is proud and celebrates its multiculturalism. And this Prime Minister has said that Canada has no core identity. We are a post-national state. So people from all over the world have come and they brought their baggage into Canada. And the good, the bad, and the ugly is all around us. We are part of it. And so this thing has now brought out all the ugliness. What were we doing having this 98-year-old man in the visitors gallery, and then everybody, 338 members, standing and giving him a standing ovation as a Canadian hero who had fought the Russians in the Second World War? My God, we send these people to the parliament, these 338 penguins, or worse. We send them to the parliament from the Prime Minister down, and they have no sense of history. They have no understanding of what this country role was in World War II.
Salim, I go back to where Rota, the Speaker of the House, introduced Hunka to Parliament. And if you look at it, a number of people have pointed out that when he's reading of Hunka's accomplishments as a veteran, Ukraine veteran, fighting the Russians, his eyes go up, as if it just finally dawned on him that, hang on a moment, during World War II, the Russians were our allies. And people are thinking that that's the moment that Rota knew that he was through.
You're absolutely right. Rota raised his eyebrows. This man apparently is a constituent of his, coming from North Bay area riding. Rota is a member of parliament from Temiskaming, Nipissing, Temiskaming riding in the North Bay area, Northern Ontario. And this gentleman, Yaroslav Hunka, is from that riding apparently. And so somebody introduced him to the speaker, and the story that is being circulating is that the speaker invited him, and so on. But we now know, we understand fully, if you want to go into the detail, that this is all a cover-up. This was a staged operation. It was orchestrated. It came out of the PMO. It came out of the PMO's closest advisor on the Ukrainian file, right from the time when the Maidan revolution took place in 2014, which is the triggering effect of the war that we are watching now. The triggering effect was not the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. It was what happened in 2014 in the Maidan coup d'etat that overthrew an elected president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, and then brought about the installation of this current president, and everything that happened between 2014 and February of 2022, which was the point in time when Putin launched this special military operation. So that's a history that deserves to be talked about. Whether we talk about it right now or some other time, we'll set it aside for the moment. But everything has been staged. I mean, Chrystia Freeland, whose grandfather was the editor of a Nazi magazine paper in Krakow and worked for the SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, grandfather Mikhail Chomiak, if I got the pronunciation right, was probably a person who knew Yaroslav Hunka. They're of the same age or of the same generation. The grandfather might have been older because Hunka joined the Waffen-SS Galicia Division in 1943, according to the public records, when he was an 18-year-old young man, and so that's another context, another story. But back here, this whole thing was orchestrated and staged. It could not have happened without the full participation of the Prime Minister's staff. Nobody can walk into the parliament. You have been there. I have been there. I've been there many a time as expert witness to participate in committee hearing in the parliament on various subjects that I've been was invited to participate in. You just cannot walk into the parliament. Your entire biography, your entire file is vetted.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, don't let this go unsaid that you were actually honored in the Senate of Canada.
Yeah, but that's another thing. I mean, it was a decision of the Senate to honor me with the 158th Medal of Canada, the sesquicentennial celebration in 2017. But the point is that nobody walks into the parliament, especially into the parliament of the nature when a head of state is visiting the parliament as the honored guest, which is, in this case, Zelenskyy. So nobody comes in without having been fully vetted. The whole due process of gathering information of that person, and then that person, when he walks in, has gone through all the tests, full body search and so on and so forth. So this was all staged because Yaroslav Hunka did not come alone. He came with his family. He came with his friends. There is, I found out, I'm sitting here and I did a little bit of quick Google search. Individuals with my limited resources do a quick Google search on the background of these people, and I find that on 22nd timeline photo of Yaroslav Hunka's granddaughter, Teresa Hunka, taking a picture of a granddad sitting in a wheelchair in a room, which is possibly a reception room in the speaker's office, sitting there. The granddaughter takes a picture and then posts it immediately on the Facebook with the line saying, Dido is waiting for Zelenskyy and Justin Trudeau, the president and the prime minister, to come to the chamber to greet Yaroslav Hunka. Okay, it's all there, unless it'll get scrubbed in the meantime, so the false narrative can then stand. But we have the screenshot. I've seen it. I've sent it to you. The point I'm getting at, again, it's a long story, but I'm trying to get it in a nutshell, is that the people, 338 members who stood and clapped for Zelenskyy and gave a standing ovation to Hunka, were all advised of what was going to happen, because it's an orchestrated affair. And most importantly, the leaders of the House, of the various parties, the Liberal leader of the House, the Conservative leader of the House, the NDP leader of the House, the Green Party leader of the House, all the leaders of the House and all the opposition leaders were fully informed of what will take place, because this is a staged affair. This is orchestrated. And so now, once it happened, and the people around the world took note of it, the backtracking began immediately after the weekend, right? It didn't happen on the weekend. It began, so there was a 2 days gap. On Monday, the 24th of September, the story began and the backtracking began, and it was all the speaker's fault that he had done his homework. And then the speaker was thrown under the bus. And the apology that you mentioned, the apology was not about, we failed. We did not do the proper vetting, or whatever would have been the word. That was not the apology to the country and to the world. The apology was, Canadians made a mistake. The Canadian Parliament made the mistake, not I, Justin Trudeau. That, the buck stops here. It stops at my table. That did not happen.
Celine, I'm reminded of an apology by one Liberal member of Parliament back, a couple of decades ago now, I think, Hetty Fry, when she basically labeled all Albertans as white supremacists burning crosses on people's lawns. Her apology stood as an exemplar for all Liberal apologies. It basically went like this: I'm sorry you're offended. It's not that I did anything wrong. It's not that, oh my God, look what I did, I should resign. It's zero ownership. It's always somebody else is to blame for being offended.
Exactly. So here it is. It was not an apology. There is no sense of, feeling remorse of what was done. It was simply how to distract, how to deflect, how to hold somebody else responsible for one's own failure. And this is the collective failure of all the members of the House of Parliament. And
you have to give Anthony Rota, though, at least some recognition that he did stand up. He did apologize. It sounded like a sincere apology, and he did fall on his sword, so to speak. So I got the impression that Rota did the right thing, even though he is a Liberal.
Well, behind the Liberal or behind the Conservative, there should be a human being with some principle, with some backbone, with some integrity. So yes, I would say more than that. I would say Rota is the only person whose resignation demonstrates some saving grace of some member, and in this case, only one member of the 338-member House. Because, Robert, this is not the first time. When in April, Zelenskyy addressed the House of Commons virtually, all the 338 members of the parliament stood up like penguins, flapping their wings.
Yeah.
And they did the same thing on Friday, September 22nd. And so for Pierre Poilievre to come around, or for Andrew Scheer as the House leader to start holding Anthony Rota responsible, or Jagmeet Singh and his House leader, and so on, and Karina Gould, the House leader for the Liberals, is complete sham. No serious person, if there is any honor among Canadian people, none is going to buy this story, or should buy this story.
It's as Andrew Scheer, the House leader for the Conservative Party in Parliament, said that they not only they should have known, they ought to have known, right? If they didn't know, they ought to have, and that's key. I think it's either that they knew and didn't care, or this, as you say, was orchestrated, or they're just incompetent. They ought to have known, but they didn't, as Scheer said. I don't know, one or the other. It's still pretty damning.
Well, I mean, when Andrew Scheer ought to be known, he should have known.
Yes. As a matter of fact, he said it only takes a few seconds to look somebody up on Google. Why didn't you do it, Andrew?
Precisely. But this is now, I mean, so this scab has been wound, and so the story now is going to pour out, not only about this, because the Prime Minister on this occasion went public saying how proud his government is, how proud he is as the Prime Minister of Canada, that his government has put out $9 billion for Zelensky's military force. $9 billion so far, and maybe more will be coming. You know, what have we been doing in this war? Whose war is this? Has anybody taken any accountability? There are voices now coming out of Europe questioning everything about this war, including senior members of the parties and partners in this war against Russia, this proxy war of NATO against Russia, led by the Americans. Zelenskyy came from New York. On 22nd, he was in Ottawa. The night before, I believe, he made a tour with the Prime Minister in Toronto, where their caravan was booed by the people. And then some of our media people, I won't mention names, but these media people immediately went on X-File, Twitter, and started posting, who are this crowd? Where do we get this Russian trolls in Toronto or in Canada? Well, this is the argument that or excuse that the Prime Minister made, that at the end of it, this is all Putin's fault. It's Putin's disinformation. So Putin now has his finger right in the PMO, directing the Prime Ministers of Canada and his staff to invite a Waffen-SS, member from the 1943 division that was waging a war of genocide against Poles and Jews, and then fighting the Russian army, that is the Soviet army, and planted him inside our parliament on Friday, the day of Yom Kippur. Well, that is an amazing feat on the part of Putin.
Oh, those Russians.
Exactly. So here is the thing. Zelenskyy came from New York because the previous week is the annual gathering of all the leaders from around the world coming to New York for the opening of the fall session of the General Assembly. So Zelenskyy addressed the UN General Assembly to almost practically an empty hall, just as did other leaders of the Western governments, like Olaf Scholz of Germany, the German Chancellor, to practically an empty hall.
It's interesting. I don't know if you saw this, Salim, but I believe it was Ukrainian media that filmed part of his speech and had B-roll shots of the audience. Right. And in the audience is Zelenskyy himself.
Yes, right. Yes, I saw that. I saw that. So, all of this is going on. And there was the Polish prime minister and the Polish president. And on September 19, that is the Monday, I believe it was, or Tuesday, in New York, the prime minister announced in public at the UN. And let me read to you what he said, among other things, but I'll just read one sentence. He says, this is the Polish prime minister, my pronunciation, please forgive me, Morawiecki, I hope I got it right, Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said, we are no longer transferring weapons to Ukraine because we are now arming Poland with modern weapons. So this was the first indication about the spat between Poland and Ukraine. And then, following the prime minister, the president of Poland, who had addressed the General Assembly, then went out of the UN building with the East River behind him. This is what he said on September 19th. He said, President Duda raised eyebrows when he compared Ukraine, quote unquote, to a drowning person clinging to anything available. Zelenskyy is right there in New York. And then he says, President Duda says, a drowning person is extremely dangerous, capable of pulling you down to the depths. So now, Poland, that has been a critical party in this proxy war against Russia since February of 2022, is distancing itself from Poland, wants to cut it down. And immediately after the events in our House of Commons on September 22nd, the Polish government immediately announced that they will be calling for an extradition of Yaroslav Hunka as a war criminal. Now, Poland is going to demand that. What have we been doing in Canada? Nurturing this member of Waffen-SS, and bringing him in to a parliament and honor him. But more importantly, what have we been doing for the past 18 months and more in this war? When nobody has explained, or this government, or what is our national interest, or why are we there? When our needs as a people is so immense, coming out of COVID-19, coming out of economy that has been, basically in the process of being dismantled. And here we are. So that's one part of the story, Robert, and it is an ugly story. But the other part of the story, and I think the more important part of the story, is the story about we are not picking upon the Ukrainian Canadians over here. I'm certainly not. I don't think you are. We are not in this discussion. But there is among that segment of Canadian population that is of Ukrainian origin, there is a substantive section in that population who were Nazis, who were members of the Ukrainian nationalist organization led by Stephen Bandera in the 1930s and 40s, that were allies, partners, collaborators, quisling with the Nazi Germany, with the Third Reich. And they waged their own ethnic, religious war of genocide against the Poles and against the Jews. And they're here, and they have been here since 1945. Mr. Hunka and people like him did not arrive here on their own. The story that is now, hopefully, more and more people will learn. I cannot believe that our media is going to tell this story, because our media is completely complicit. We don't have an open and free and critical media. It's not a free media. CBC is not going to talk about it. CBC is not going to invite people like you and me to come on a panel discussion, or CTV or Global or any one of these, that has been bought over by the Canadian government, by Liberal Party, by Justin Trudeau. But Canadians themselves, like you and I are doing, will take the initiative and interest to dig into their own history.
There was a documentary on 60 Minutes. 26 years ago in 1997, they had a 15-minute documentary piece on why Canada has become a safe haven for Nazis. And it featured a Brooklyn investigative reporter or investigator, Jew, who came to Canada to track down and had a list of 1,000, just the top 1,000 most egregious names. And he said most of them he found in the phone book. And yet supposedly the RCMP was charged with tracking down these Nazis that were in Canada. And he found a good portion of them just by looking in the phone book. And he mentioned, or another person mentioned, that back in that time, a Nazi after the war was given automatic entry into the country simply by showing their SS tattoo, which convinced the Border Patrol Agency, of course, that they weren't communists, at least. So they come on in. And Canada is getting the reputation, or at least has the reputation, of being as bad as Argentina when it comes to cozying up to Nazis after the war.
Well, there were at a minimum 2 stages in which the Nazis, Ukrainian Nazis in particular, since we're talking about this segment of the population, apart from, Germans, Nazis, members of the Third Reich, who came to Canada. There were 2 stages. One was towards the end of the war, and then the end of the war itself, May 8, 1945. That was the first stage in which a rat line was opened by the Americans, the OSS, which is the precursor to the making of the CIA in 1947. During the war, it was the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. They opened the rat line to a whole host of German Nazi officers and leaders into South America. You just mentioned Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay. And then for the Ukrainians, the Stephen Bandera group and groups allied to Stephen Bandera's group, the rat line was open to the Five Eyes country, that is Canada, Britain, again, organized by OSS and MI6. So Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. Okay. And why did that happen? We'll come to it in a moment. So that was the first stage. The second stage was when in the 1950s, 1954, 55, 56, when Khrushchev came to power in the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin in 1953, Khrushchev began sort of de-Stalinizing process in the Soviet Union, which culminated ultimately in 1956 with the famous secret speech that he gave to the leadership of the Communist Party of Soviet Union in their annual convention, where he held Stalin responsible for the excesses that he had done. And that was, in a sense, the thaw, the opening, and it was going to lead to, and tried to lead to, from the point of view of Moscow. That's Khrushchev and his people. At that time, Khrushchev was the Secretary General of the Communist Party and Premier of the Soviet government. The effort that was mounted, a peaceful coexistence with the West, to lower down the temperature of the Cold War, etc., etc. So in that process, Khrushchev released over 100,000 Ukrainian from the Gulag archipelago that Solzhenitsyn wrote about. That is the prison camps in the far north and east of Soviet Union, in Kazakhstan, in Siberia, etc. They were serving life sentences if they had not been shot by being put against the wall. Solzhenitsyn himself was in the Gulag. So over 100,000 Ukrainians that had been picked up, arrested, prisoners of war, were released as a gesture, as a goodwill gesture in the process of peaceful coexistence. So who were these people? These are the people who had fought the Soviet army, which is what our speaker was mentioning, the hero who had fought the Russians, So they fought the Russians. So they had fought the Russian in the company of whom, or in the service of whom? Hitler, the Third Reich, the German Nazis, and in the process, the genocides were committed. Right now, where the war is taking place in Ukraine. Ukraine was not only the bloodlands, but also the badlands, of Eastern Europe, where all of this comes together. The Baltic states, Eastern Poland, of course, Ukraine itself, Russia, and this is where it meets. Ukraine has been the gateway. Poland and Ukraine has been the gateway of European armies invading Russia. Again, 338 members of our parliament possibly have no knowledge of this history and won't want to know that the invasions of Russia, going all the way back to the Napoleonic invasion, and then the German invasion during the World War I, and then the German invasion of Hitler, Operation Barbarossa, that began in 1941. The gateway into Russia or into the Soviet Union was through Poland and Ukraine. So these were released, and they came and were parceled out and distributed to Canada, to Australia, to New Zealand, to Britain, So that's the two bunch of people, or two waves of these Ukrainian Nazis who arrived over here. And none of them were questioned. None of them were examined. As you say, that was the passport, because the war against Russia, at that time Soviet Union, began immediately as the war against Germany was coming to an end. We talked about this. The dropping of the A-bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had nothing to do with the Japanese war. It was indeed, if you look back upon it and put it in historical context, and we need to, because now it is going on we're rapidly approaching the 100th anniversary of the war. Will be in a short time. You and I might not be around, but it's there. We're getting there. So this is history. We have to look back in a historical term. The greatest war crime against humanity, was committed by Truman, who in a flash of a second incinerated over 200,000 Japanese when the war was basically over. And his military commanders and naval commanders had said, there's no use, no purpose to use the A-bomb in Japan because the war is over. The war, that is, the A-bomb was dropped as the first bullet fired against Soviet Union and Russia. So the alliance immediately shifted. I cannot hold Speaker Anthony Rota at fault, because what is his age? He's possibly of our generation. How many of our generation in Canada will recall that the Soviet Union was not only an ally, but as Ernest Hemingway famously said that anybody who loves freedom can never pay the debt to the Soviet Union for defeating Nazi Germany. How many people know that? The casualty of the war is estimated at somewhere close to 50 million. 50 million people died, physically dead. Well, half of that 50 million, if not more than half, were Russian and Polish people. Polish, including the Jews, the 6 million number that is used in terms of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, non-Jews, Polish non-Jews, and close to 27, 28 million Russian. That's more than half the figure, 34, 35, 36 million people of the 50 million people who died in World War II were Russians and Poles. And so, yet, the war was immediately begun against the Soviet Union. So that's a story that people have airbrushed away or have covered up. Well, now the scab is being removed. At the end of the day, Robert, my argument is that we are all responsible. The 338 members sitting there, this man, Justin Trudeau, who basically is a cipher. I don't expect anything from this man. Why should you expect anything from this man, Robert, or anybody else? He's a cipher. He's a placeholder. He's given a script. Didn't he say he's a drama teacher? We didn't ask what sort of a drama teacher. We just say he's a drama teacher. He's not a historian. He's not a lawyer. He's not an accountant. He's not a neurosurgeon. He's none of that. He's a black-faced drama teacher. Well, what is Zelenskyy? Isn't he an actor? Doesn't he play piano with a body part? So these are ciphers. These are ciphers who have been put into that position. So to do their part. So they're playing a role. This military commander who was clapping, who was up in the gallery with Yaroslav Hunka clapping, is no different than the chief of staff who retired last year. The name escapes me right now, who in his retirement speech, when he was being awarded the WWII Award, one of the more prestigious military awards, on his retirement, talked about that if you want to watch the excellence and leadership in the contemporary world, people who decry, who say that there are no leaders in the Western world, well, they should look at Zelenskyy. He's the very epitome of leadership. I am not writing these words. These were the words of the Canadian Chief of Staff on his retirement, right? There is a 3-star general, a Canadian 3-star general who was picked up in Mariupol and is a prisoner of war in Russia right now. If my memory serves me, his name is Trevor Kedo, Lieutenant General Trevor Kedo. He was in Mariupol in the Azov Steel area, a steel plant, dug in, which then eventually surrendered in late summer of 2022, after that campaign was over. And he came out of there, and within that industrial plant were a number of biolabs. And that story has been covered up. It is a story that came out of Russia, as the name was prepared. You have all of the military commanders in the US, in the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense is a 4-star general, retired Lloyd Austin. The Chief of Staff, 4-star General Mark Milley. The whole lot of them are in full embrace of the Azov Brigade, the Ukrainian Nazi army. They have financed it. The Americans, and of course, the NATO countries had done their part in financing the Ukrainian army, which is a Nazi army.
Given all of that we now know, would you consider our country to be basically the same as a country in Nazi Germany? Surely we are not there yet, right? But the parallels are ominous, aren't they? Aren't we approaching that quite quickly?
Well, this is the story that remains suppressed, but the facts are coming out, as you say. My metaphor is the scab is out, pulled, and all the pus is coming out for us to see. The question is whether we're going to clean it up or we will go back to Rip Van Winkle's sleep for the next 20 years. The facts are all the apparatus of what is a totalitarian regime with the different faces on it is very much present and has been used and in operation whenever needed by the state, by the government. We saw that what happened with the Truck of Freedom, the Freedom Convoy, 2022. Our Charter of Rights and Freedom, which is our constitution, was just ripped apart and thrown away.
Maybe now is a good time for me just to refresh people's memory of what this country is actually like and how it can be compared to either the Weimar Republic or to Nazi Germany, at least at the beginning, 1933, right, 34. Because as you say, the truckers' convoy certainly brought a lot of this home. I'll just quickly run through this list and people can fill in the blanks with their own examples, right? First of all, we're socialist. There's no question of that. This is the society we live in. We have high inflation. So did the Weimar Republic. Mind you, they had hyperinflation. We have high inflation. Censorship, that's self-evident. Forced medical experimentation without consent. An admiration for basic dictatorship. Remember Trudeau's speech about China? The destruction of founding institutions. The tearing down of statues of men better than they are. Think of John A. Macdonald or Dundas. Revisionist history, especially when it comes to things like the Aboriginal question. Sympathy with terrorists. Think of the Khalistani separatists. Turning a blind eye to the burning of churches. That's happening all over the country. Martial law to quell peaceful protests. The police following the dictates of politicians rather than the law. State funding and control of the media. That's a given. That's what this country has. War with Russia. Germany went to war with Russia. We're at war with Russia. Euthanasia of the mentally ill. It's going on. It's sanctioned by the state. Intolerance of dissent, freezing the bank account of dissenters, imprisonment of dissenters. There's people in jail right now who are part of the truckers' convoy. Racism. I could find of no more deserving moniker to describe Trudeau than racist. Arbitrary detention without due process. State indoctrination through total control of the education system. Destruction of the family. Genital mutilation of children. Unfettered abortion. A culture of hate. A culture of exclusion. An ideology of superiority. Sounds like Nazis. Sounds like Trudeau. An attitude of arrogance. Eugenics. And for that, consider Tommy Douglas, the founding father in Canada of our socialized medical system. He was a eugenicist. And he just didn't give it up. He was a eugenicist for decades. He wrote a thesis on it. A diminishing diplomacy and international relations. Think of India and Trudeau recently. A worsening international reputation. Think of last Friday. And the glorification of Nazis and Nazism. Again. So, in short, what our current parliament, our current country has in common with Nazi Germany is a desire for total power and control over every aspect of our lives. This is a country where the individual is subservient to the state, just like it was in Nazi Germany. Now, of course, there's people saying, like, what are you talking about? We're not doing the atrocities that Hitler did during the Second World War, and that is true on that scale. But you ask Artur Pawlowski, who spent considerable amount of time in solitary confinement, for feeding the poor or for giving a speech. You ask Tamara Lich whether or not she doesn't consider herself a political prisoner. You look at that applauding of this actual Nazi in Parliament, and or the lockdowns over the last few years, the destruction of our economy, the inflation rate, which makes it almost impossible for some people to live, certainly not to buy a house or to rent an apartment or to eat meat or to buy gas. And don't tell me that, yeah, sure, we're not like the Nazis during 1944, 1942 to 45, but we're getting there.
Well, whether we are getting there or we have been there, except in moderated and mitigated because of political circumstances, the facts of the matter is, coming back to Hunka, coming back to what this story indicates in that largest sense, it's got several dimensions on the Ukrainian Nazis in Canada, in Australia, in America, in Britain. The storyline is that, as I said, there were two waves. The first wave, Britain, Churchill was the prime minister, and then Churchill lost the election in 1945, so that he called soon after the war was over on May 8th, and he lost the election. But he was the prime minister during this period. The Germans who surrendered to the Allied powers, which is Britain and America, and among them the Ukrainian Nazis, the Bandera group that surrendered. They're sent the rat line by them. The choice was, based upon the Yalta Agreement, based upon the fact that the Soviet Union was not only an ally, but had borne the main brunt of the war in Europe. And without the Soviet Union, the Germans would not have been defeated when they were defeated. Eventually, Germans would have been defeated, but, the fact of the matter is that we're not talking about the eventuality, we're talking about when it happened, and the time and moment and circumstances under which it happened. That is May of 1945, was with the Soviet Union as our ally. And these Nazis, Germans, Ukrainians, and others who surrendered to the American army, to the British army, were not handed over to the Soviet Union because they had fought against the Soviet Union, right? They had fought in Eastern and Central Europe. They were not handed over. They were not brought to justice. There was no accounting for them. They were safely transferred to America, to Britain, to Canada, to Australia, New Zealand. And that's the big question that people have to answer if people are really serious about it. That is, the people who are in power, who have been elected, who hold the documents, the archives, have the knowledge about it, or need to get the information. They need to come out and tell us why this was done. We had fought a war. 50 million people had died. These were the people responsible. It was 18-year-old Hunkas of the Ukrainian Nazis who went around killing Poles and Jews, as in Babi Yar, that in a matter, I believe, of 48 hours or a week or less than that. I mean, I believe this is also a world record, that physically, with guns, over 34,000 Jews were killed, thrown into the mass grave ditches and rolled over, you know. Women were raped, mothers were raped and killed, babies were killed and, you know, tortured, etc., etc. Horrible crimes against humanity that send shivers even as we think about and speak about it. None of these people were held accountable. None of these people have answered. 80 years later, on September 22nd, Hunka, as a representative of that group of people, is being applauded. And in 80 years, he has not made any repentance, and nobody's asked him, okay? But he can disappear into the crowd until he was brought to the gallery in Ottawa, the visitors' gallery in our House of Commons. He was unknown as a person, except to the people around him, his family, his community, and so on. But right across Canada, here in Ontario, in Alberta, and in other parts of Canada, there are monuments and memorial to the Bandera group, to the Ukrainian Nazis. In Oakville, there is a huge monument with all the Azov battalion sign and in stone grafted, dedicated to the Waffen-SS Galicia Division. You know, in other words, we Canadians, of whatever background, we keep passing by these monuments and memorials in a collective amnesia. None of us stop and ask, what? What is this there for? You know, as our soldiers, Canadian veterans of the 20th century wars that are still alive, no one from World War I is there, but from World War II, we still have few, the Korean War and so on and so forth. And their progeny, their generation, who gather on November 11th, the Remembrance Day. Well, there are others who are gathering at these monuments, like in Oakville, like in Alberta, to commemorate their heroes. And who are their heroes? Their heroes are the people who Canada at that time, in 1939, 1945, were fighting against, as the Americans were fighting against.
I just really genuinely have a real sense of history right now.
You know, we have in our universities, in the University of Alberta, for instance, a quick Google search will show it to you. We have, you know, scholarship funds in the name of the Ukrainian heroes, the Bandera group. And I discovered that University of Alberta has a scholarship fund in the name of Yaroslav Hunka. And so for Christia Freeland, who comes from Alberta, to say she doesn't know about this, she's a historian or she studied history. So we have all of this information right here for the last at least half a century, but going all the way back to 45. Nobody asked. Why nobody asked? Because that million or so Ukrainian Canadian is a very powerful lobby that you need to suck upon to get elected, right? So it is a circle. When you sup with the devil, when you dance with the devil, you eventually become part of the devil. That is what we have. If you flip over, we have Jewish members of parliament. We have Jewish organization in this country who are supposed to represent the interests, the memories, the heartaches, and the joys of the Jewish people around the world and here in Canada. But Jews are not a monolithic people. No more than Christians are monolithic. Muslims, Sikh, Hindus, Buddhists, no one is a monolithic people. No one group as a people can claim, our hands are clean and we are virtuous. So I told my friends, my Jewish friends, when this problem began in 2022, but going all the way back to 2014, that the Ukraine war is going to reveal very nasty things. And it's going to come out. And when the war began with Russia, or the proxy war, I said the Russians have in their archive all the stories going way back into the 1920s and 30s. So the Eastern European Jews have a very mixed story. Their story is also, why is it that for the last 18 months in this war, just 18 months if we don't go all the way back, why is it that the Jewish voices have gone along with this outrage that the collective West, United States, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, the collective West is invested in supporting Ukraine in the name of democracy, where every aspect of democracy has been shredded. Churches have been closed down. Zelensky's, in fact, postponed the election for the presidency, right? During the two world wars, America didn't postpone presidential election or congressional election. But in the name of democracy, collective West is invested in a country that is right at the bottom of corruption of all form. It is the most corrupt country in the world. It is a laundromat for corruption. And it is run by Nazis, Ukrainian Nazis. Where is the Jewish voices on this matter? In fact, it is just the opposite. There's been a celebration that Zelenskyy is the greatest hero. He's a Jew, and he's the greatest hero of Jews, and in this case, the Jews of Ukraine. He's standing up against the Russian. So who funds Zelenskyy? Is a whole phalanx of Ukrainian Jewish oligarchs. Igor Kolomoisky is the leading name. Zelenskyy was an actor in his studio. He financed his campaign. And it is not only Igor Kolomoisky. He's not alone. A whole lot of them. And then you have presidents like Poroshenko, a Jew, a Nazi, And so the story comes out. And the story comes out and will come out, more of them will come out, that the Eastern European Jews were engaged on both sides of the equation. They were engaged on the one side with the German Nazis. Hitler and his Third Reich had Jews in their organization. There enough record of that. People can go and study this. I have a book right here in my hand, Zionism in the Age of Dictator by Lenny Brenner. Name, numbers, accounts of German Jews who participated with the Nazis. And that we can see they're participating with the Ukrainian Nazis, And that is a story that has been suppressed and airbrushed away. So the East European Jews, the Jews of Russia, of Poland, modern Poland, of Lithuania, of Estonia, of Latvia, of Ukraine, they are what is historically known as, and has been suppressed, the Khazarian Jews. They're not Semites. There's nothing Semitic about them. Not an iota of Semitism is there. That means they're not, like the Arabs are Semites. The Sephardim Jews are Semites. The Jews of the third world, of the global south, of the Arab world, they're Semites. So now the whole story is going to come out. People are going to ask the question, what has Khazarian Jews, because the celebration of Zelenskyy by the East European Jews is a celebration, the current issue of the Economist magazine, the current issue, I don't have it in my hand, is carrying the story. It has a several-page story on the Ukraine war on Zelenskyy, but it carries the story of the huge movement that is now taking place from Israel and from other parts of Europe of the Khazarian Jew, that is the European Jews, going to Ukraine. That this is coming back home. Well and good, fine, coming back home. So what has been happening in the Middle East, in Israel? What were the claims over there? What was the fight over there? This story is going to grow in nature. The global south that is affected in this war in its own way, and the consequences are spreading, we haven't even touched it. The rise of BRICS nation, that is coming together. They're going to dig into the story. They're going to ask questions. Yeah. So there's a lot of skeleton in the West. There's a lot of skeleton in Canada, hidden in our cupboards, will have to be explored. But I doubt it whether the people in power will allow that investigation, or will not slam down upon free speech as disinformation and misinformation to clamp it down, or deplatform those voices who are going to ask these questions. People cannot write about these things in the current state of affairs that we are in, It is basically narratives that are being told. Narratives are constructed to airbrush away the hard facts. But they are going to persist. They might not be told over here in Canada, but they are going to be told in Africa, they're going to be told in India, they're going to be told in China. But most importantly, all of this will be flung at the face of the Western world when this war at some point comes to an end and the Russian bring these people to account publicly for what has happened. Just to make one more point on this matter, in this 18 months, nearly 500,000 Ukrainian men have died, young and old, close to 500,000 in 18 months. In the entire Second World War, America did not have a casualty of 500,000.
I think it was 440,000, if memory serves. Yeah,
exactly. So here it is. I have this is when Zelenskyy was in States, in Washington, after coming from New York, the UN General Assembly session. He went to Washington to meet with the congressional leaders, and this is what Mitch McConnell, the Senate minority leader, Republican minority leader, in greeting Zelenskyy, this is what he said. We saw the pictures of it. On the one side, we saw Chuck Schumer, the Senate majority leader, Democrat, taking a bowing at Zelenskyy. Chuck Schumer is a North American Jew, Zelenskyy is a Ukrainian Jew. Well, they're bowing at each other. Fine. That's the Democrat. The Republican, which McConnell says, and let me read to you, American support for Ukraine is not charity. It's in our own direct interest, not least because degrading Russia helps to deter China. Not because degrading Russia helps to deter China. This man is a walking evil, has an absolute internal void of any moral concern. For him, Ukrainians are simply instruments, pawns on the American chess table. So now they're fighting Russia to the last man and sending the message, we're going to come after you, China. And they're already talking about that, you know. So these are just dispensable pawns in the hands of this uniparty empire that is what United States has become. So far away from anything that was in the imagination and in the making of the American Republic by the founding fathers, by George Washington and Jefferson and Madison and Adams and so on and so forth. That's what America has become. Canada, we have been a vassal state all along. We continue to be a vassal state. So there it is. We embrace them. And if you go before 1939 war, we had our prime minister going to Berlin to meet with Hitler. It lavish praise, with lavish praise, Mackenzie King. And then it was his government that basically said, when the Jews of Europe were trying to flee from Hitler and the Third Reich, it was his government that said, one is one too many. All on the record.
It's somebody recently said online that there are no good guys. If you go in through history, you will see atrocities on both sides, and there are no good guys. There are good ideas, there are bad ideas, there are good ideologies, there are bad ideologies and philosophies. But when it comes onto the battlefield, there are no good guys.
But I would beg to differ on that if you want to wrap this up. I would beg to differ. There are good guys as individuals.
As individuals, yes. And that brings up...
You stand with your moral concern. In the midst of the war, 1939, 1945, in the horrors of the war, they were good guys. They were good Germans. All Germans were not Nazi. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was, hanged with a piano string by the Nazis. There were many. There were those young people, German people, young students in Berlin and elsewhere who are known as, who created this group, if I recall, my memory serves me, White Rose. They were protesting, they were demonstrating within the limited capacity, with the war on, with the entire power of the German state being used by the Nazis to crush any opposition, beginning with the Reichstag fire in 1933 that brought Hitler into power and chancellorship, and all the way until Hitler blew his brain out in 1945. Yeah. But there are good guys.
When we delve into history, as you and I have over the last few years, and go back to some of our previous videos on this, we've re-examined our side, because we always thought we were the good guys. And in many respects, a capitalist, free, individualist society is better than a collectivist, statist, socialist society. But now we see that everything is coming together and there's a uniparty. And there's a global effort to destroy all nations, and we're part of that horrible effort. But what I wanted to talk about, Salim, or at least to mention, is that I'm glad you started your comments by saying that no religion is monolithic, right? There are no groups that are monolithic. I, as a Canadian, do not share the opinions of my parliamentarians, my prime minister. So I hope that people watching this from other countries don't say that, oh, look at Canada. Canadians as a whole, as a monolith, think this. We do not. As a matter of fact, a lot of these people in office, most of them, as a matter of fact, are there because of our system where first past the post means that they get in. They don't even have to have a majority of voters elect them in. Just like Hitler, by the way. He wasn't elected by a majority. He ended up being the chancellor. And so there's no monolithic group out there where every single member should be tarred and feathered with the same brush and feathers. And that goes, by the way, for people who may have been Germans who wore the uniform during the Second World War. A lot were conscripted, a lot were volunteers, a lot did not know that they were going to be asked to do. Think of everything that just happened in the last few years here in this country and in the collective West when it came to lockdowns, when it came to injecting people with stuff that nobody knew the consequences of. And people lined up willingly, got their jab, put their little symbol on their Facebook thing. I was just vaccinated. Look at me. Think of that mentality. The thing about humanity is we're capable of such greatness and we're capable of such depravity and such irrationality. We're a mixed bag. Everybody's a mixed bag. And so when you talk about Jews, when you talk about Christians or Muslims, or Germans, or Europeans, or Ukrainians, or Russians, it's a mixed bag of millions of different people, all with different ideas and all with different agendas. But when we talk collectively, as we do, and we have to talk collectively, then we're not painting everybody with the same brush. There's always outliers. There's always factions that don't agree. So I just want to make that point clear. But if we want to wrap this up, and I think perhaps we should, we've covered a lot of territory. I wanted to impress upon people that, we talked about ominous parallels between Nazi Germany or under the Weimar Republic and Canada today. Also, there's another parallel. I mean, you've told me to read this book, A.G.P. Taylor's The Origins of the Second World War. Fantastic look into what went into that conflict and the creation of that conflict. And if there's anything, no, back then, right, 1939, specific people with specific issues on a specific time in specific locations, none of which is repeatable, right? But what is repeatable, and what I think is also a parallel, is that look at the people on this cover, right? We're looking at narcissists. We're looking at psychopaths. We're looking at people who crave control and power. And as long as we have these kinds of people in our parliaments, in our Congress, then history can repeat. We can have ugly events like what's going on in Ukraine, 500,000 Ukrainians dead, so far removed from us, and the numbers astound. But I think that the ominous parallel that we really have to understand is that human nature, it can be pretty ugly. And as long as we have these kinds of psychopathic, narcissistic, nihilistic people elected to office or who take office through nefarious means, then anything is open. We could be in for a very rough ride in the future. So let's consider that when we think about Trudeau and Biden, our leaders, and Zelenskyy and Putin, all the bunch. We should look at these characters because that's who we're following, as sheep or willingly. But then there's people like you and I who just sit back and think of it as theater, a tragedy. If any theater is involved, it is a tragedy. So Salim, do you want the final word?
Well, our effort, Robert, however small and limited and constrained it is, given time, given the situation in which you started this discussion, like all the other discussions we have engaged in, can only go so far. But the motive behind this effort, knowing very well that can only go so far and our resources are so limited and a capacity to cover it, is also finite. Given all of that, the motive, I believe, is to awaken in some manner, to ignite in the minds of those who tune in to listen to us, to begin ask questions. They might not have the answer, but you cannot have the answer unless you begin asking questions. It goes all the way back to Socrates. We might pay the price that Socrates pays. I don't mean in personal term. I mean in people who ask questions might end up paying the price that Socrates paid, that he was put to death for asking questions. But it's only by asking questions that one can begin to re-examine what is the established narrative. The narrative is always written by the winner. And the winner writes the narrative, as Churchill said, I will write the history. Writes the narrative to basically what Stalin did. Airbrush pictures. He removed all the pictures of Trotsky with Lenin. It was him alone, and so on and so forth.
Oh, to that point, the Liberals have, what's her name, Gould, the Liberal House leader, has suggested that the Hansard record be expunged as regarding the adulation of Hunka, talking about airbrushing history. Yeah. Hansard, by the way, to those who don't know, is the official written record of what went on in Parliament. They want that expunged.
They expunge, and maybe all of the political parties will engage in it, because each one have their own hidden skeleton. So a precedent will be established that they can then go back and expunge records. So there it is. It is a narrative that is constructed, and if we do not ask questions, we will never know what the hard facts were. The Second World War had many fathers and mothers in the making of the war. It just didn't happen because there was one bad guy, Hitler. All of the European leaders were involved in the mess that had happened after World War I, in the Treaty of Paris, the Versailles Treaty, that laid the groundwork for the eventual rise of Hitler. And then to take the rise of Hitler and his politics and use that for their own purpose. This was, as Patrick Buchanan and others have said and have written about it, and as I have myself explored, looking back 80 years and counting, this was not the good war that Churchill wrote about. This was the unnecessary war in which 50 million people died. And the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia is not the good war of democracy. It is the perpetual war for perpetual peace of the empire, in this case, the empire run by the United States, which has nothing to do with your and my idealistic vision and support and embrace and our hopes and our values tied up with the vision that was put in writing and in record by the founding fathers in the Constitution, in the Declaration of Independence, and so on and so forth. So we are far, far, far removed from those ideals and those visions in what the United States of America, of Biden and the neocons, of Obama and the neocons, of Mitch McConnell and the Uniparty is and became, that Eisenhower talked about as the military-industrial complex, and which Donald Trump has talked about as the deep state, that anything to do with such political power is nothing but evil in itself. And everybody who is engaged with that, either participating in it, drawing their material wealth out of it, or standing aside and making apologetics for it, are all complicit in the lies and the evil of what the deep state does. The deep state has already consumed, like a pagan emperor or autocrat, feeding their pagan gods with blood. America has already consumed by paying 500,000 men into this pagan god that they are worshiping for the arguments of running their military industrial complex, their deep state, and people need to ask these questions. What are we here for? What is it? And so the good thing, just again, from my point, to wrap this up, the good thing, the positive thing, the silver lining is that what happened in the House of Commons on Friday, September 22nd, can lead to all of us engaging and examining these things and taking responsibility. And we can dream, you and I can dream, that if the Canadian people are really serious, really want the country to be a model of freedom and virtue, then let us all together come together and fumigate our House of Commons, get rid of the 338 penguins and cockroaches and scums out of there, and get a new band of people in there who will always be held accountable for what they do, and accountable to the people who will demand answers, who will ask the question. And that's the vigilance. I think it was Jefferson who said, the tree of freedom requires the blood of freedom fighters and martyrs every 20 years, to refresh itself. So if you're going to be free people, if we want to be virtuous people, then we have to be ready to do our part, because the people that we have sent to the parliament are not going to do their part.
I think that's a very positive note that we can end on, Salim. Thank you very much.
Thank you.